Que yo veo la...
Espera, déjame buscar esto del DIC.
Yo lo busco, bueno. Pásame tu computador y yo lo busco.
Ok.
Yo lo veo.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Water Resources webinar series at the Department of Civil Engineering at Universidad de Chile. My name is Pablo Mendoza, and I'm an associate professor. And today we have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Tomás Trewhela. So Tomás is assistant professor in the Faculty of Engineering and Sciences, Universidad, Adolfo Ibañez. His research focuses on granular materials and their flow, with special interest in particle size aggregation, debris flow, sediment bed forms, and bed load transport. So Tomás, thanks a lot for being here with us, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Pablo. I will share screen, and then I will talk a little bit, a brief message before starting. So, okay, now. Yes, well, thank you, Pablo, for the presentation, the introduction, and of course the invitation. Also, I want to thank Nicolas. I always like this kind of seminars. We were talking with Nico and Pablo about how this seminar started, and I remember that I presented when I was a master's student. So I always accept this invitation because it's a good stage for testing and showing some interesting things that we're doing. And in this case, I prepared a brief presentation on a work that I've been doing the last couple of months of an article that I hope to submit soon. And it's titled Shear-driven segregation in granular flows, coupled Stokes problem. And what you see as the background image is an arrangement of a granular bulk of two different grains of different sizes, but with the same frictional properties. And what is interesting is that it's precisely what I will show you today, but from a numerical and theoretical perspective. And just to put in perspective that how important the idealized Stokes problem is until today. So it's still a very important problem to analyze. So to start, there are two topics that I will talk in this presentation. One is segregation, and today I don't see that much assistance to this, or there isn't a lot of people in the audience, and it's fine for me because as human beings we tend to segregate. So the fact that only some people or a couple of people is around this seminar talks about the interest and how we're segregated by interest, by discipline, by society, racial, class. All these type of aspects in our life segregate us. So, in this sense, I like these two paintings. One is of Democritus that talk about segregation, but from the atomist kind of perspective. So thinking about matter and how matter is composed, he said that matter is composed by segregated particles that arrange themselves among the same kind. And on the other hand, we'll talk about rheology, and it's a science, as Professor Tamburino knows, that came after a discussion between two scientists that were from different fields, Marcus Reiner and Eugene Bingham in 1928, and discuss about scientific aspects of the flow of things. And they came up with the idea, or the idea to coin the term rheology, based on the Panta ray from Heraclitus. And what's interesting about these two is that these two paintings are in the same hall in the Rijksmuseum, and they're from the same painter. So basically, not only what I will show you today is a coupling of two physical processes, it's also a coupling in art. So it kind of all falls into the same bin. So to put a little bit more of perspective on segregation, this is something that happens in our day-to-day life. From something as common as segregating potatoes in not in a factory, but in an exportation facility, to the pharmaceutical industry and the food industry again. Every time that we find particles of different sizes, shape, or even colors, we can segregate them. Okay. And it's also a natural process. So if we agitate a bag of nuts, normally you will find all the big nuts at the top. So this is well known in the industry as the Brazilian nut effect. So Brazilian nuts are always at the top. The same happens with almonds and nuts. But when you go towards the bottom, you will find all the ground particles together with the peanuts and the raisins, which are normally, or at least me, the less preferred nuts. But this not only happens in this type of small scale type of granular bulks, it also happens with the natural flows. So each time that we have a debris flows, you will find structures such as levees or bulky fronts, where segregation also happens naturally. So here, for instance, we see in Chosica in 2020, a flow that created like large levees, as we see here. In Aysén also, from the aerial views, we see that particles are also segregating here. And the image helped us because the segregation was also of particles that happened to have different colors. But embedded here is also a difference in size, okay? And in Switzerland, also, I show here an event that also happens almost yearly in the same place called Chamoisson. And also we see here some structures at the sides that are called levees and are normally a place where you find large particles. So that's an evidence of particle size segregation. Now, in terms of rheology, it's also something very natural of granular flows. The rheology of granular flows is not very well defined. So normally for fluids, as most people that are here in this witnessing this seminar will know, for fluids it's quite easy. So the rheology is characterized by a constant viscosity. So there is a linear relationship between shear rate and shear stress. But that doesn't happen with the granular flows. There is no constituted relationship that ties shear rate and shear stress. And the only possibility to tie something that happens within the granular bulk is to tie shear stress and normal stresses. And how they are tied? They are tied via a Coulombic frictional coefficient, this mu. And as you see, mu is constant, so it's not like the mu of the rheology, doesn't have any units. It's a frictional kind of angle, or it's tied to the frictional angle. And recently, some researchers and in specific the French school promoted the usage of an inertial number. So it's a non-dimensional number that puts into a kind of a mixer the shear rate, the size of the particles, and pressure in a way to tie the transfer of normal stresses and shear stresses within a granular bulk. And this inertial number, how it's tied to this mu? They are tied basically by an empirical relationship. This relationship, you just fit two parameters, this mu2 and mu1, for a specific mixture of grains or a specific material or ground material. And inversely, you can also produce a relationship for I, or the inertial number, as a function of these two parameters, and a third parameter, I naught, which is a material property. But the main message here is, well, the inertial number depends effectively on a particle size. It's very clear, the dependence, it's a linear dependence. So the first question that arises is, or that comes up is, what happens when particles are of different sizes? And not only that, but also what happens when these particles are redistributed? As I said, when you shake a granular bulk, they will redistribute these particles. So what happens with the rheology for such a clear dependence? And that's when particle size segregation comes into play. there are two main mechanisms that characterize the shear-driven mechanisms. One is a kinetic seeding. So basically you have, I don't know if you see my hands, but I'm moving the hands. So particle layers form like sieves, and small particles will tend to fall once the relative movement opens gaps for these particles to percolate. And conversely, large particles will move up, or normally up, via the squeeze expulsion mechanism, which is these red particles moving upwards. And this squeeze expulsion doesn't have a preferred direction. It's only the effect of small particles kind of pushing this large particle towards another level of particles. Imagine yourself being surrounded by small kids in a kindergarten. So basically the small kids may push you towards a direction that the kids will, or the children will select. On the other way around, imagine a small kid inside the metro wagon. The small kid will not feel the presence of the large and will move freely among the adults that will move relative between them. So that's a way to visualize these two mechanisms. Now, the way to model this is via an advection or convective diffusive equation for segregation, which I show here, that characterize the concentration of particles, whether they're small, large, or different sizes. They are associated to a concentration P, and then or phi, and then there are some fluxes or preferent fluxes that characterize segregation. So here is the advective term, here is the diffusive term, and here you have the segregation term. And the segregation term has been a matter of research for the last 3 decades, starting with a function that is quadratic, a cubic function here by Bridgewater, then a quadratic function by Dolgunin and Kolov, and lately in the last decade, a cubic function again, but with an asymmetric term, which is the last term at the right. And recently, with some colleagues, we elaborated in my PhD thesis, we elaborated a fully developed function for this segregation flux that depends now on physical parameters. So in the previous expressions, it only depends on a parameter, a single parameter, but that parameter did not have a physical parameterization. So now with this full function, we have such parameterization. But one question still is unanswered is, well, is it that segregation is not only distributing particles, is it also reducing rheology or the friction within the bulk? And how can we characterize or quantify this coupling? So with all that introduction, the objective of this presentation or this work is to study the segregation rheology feedback, or how these two processes are coupled in one single problem. Okay, and I show here to emphasize this coupling with another debris flow that show this very clear leves at the sides, and also the bulk front that is characterized with the large boulders at the front. And why I say this, because there is, of course, an influence of the particle size ratio. So basically how large are these particles compared to the ones in the middle or in the rest of the bulk? What about the asymmetric behavior? So you can exert this size ratio into an asymmetric behavior that is a ratio of the size ratio. Kind of it's not a familiar definition, but you will see that it comes into help in the results. But not only the size ratio is relevant, also the frictional properties. So I spoke about this mu of I rheology that is characterized by this mu coefficient. So are there any changes in the frictional properties when I change the frictional or the size ratio? And then I can kind of explore into the idea of a frictional ratio as well. So I have a particle size ratio, but what about I include a frictional ratio? And then the scope or the focus will be put on the velocity profiles and the associated timescales for the processes involved. now moving towards the methods, the theoretical setup, I put here better called Stokes. I found this very nice portrait of George Gabriel Stokes. And it's, well, it was funny because it looks like Saul Goodman from the series, so that's why I said better called Stokes. And why the problem of Stokes? Because the Stokes problem basically is a momentum diffusion problem in one direction. It consists of a semi-infinite plate, or an infinite plate, sorry, moving or suddenly set into motion over a semi-infinite continuum fluid medium. Okay, and then how the temporal evolution is tied to the diffusion of the momentum in the space. They are tied via the viscosity. And this is interesting because, as I said, there is no clear viscosity for granular flows. So I will explain a little bit on that. But the interesting thing is that the Stokes problem allows the coupling with more or additional processes, especially if they are diffuse. They are diffusive as well. And as I said, the particle size segregation is also a diffusive process. So then I can tie momentum diffusion, so basically the rheology, and segregation. I don't know, I think I'm fine with it for the moment. I will take out my cell phone for time. So the bidispersed granular Stokes problem now looks like this. So it's a shear, or sorry, it's a layer of small particles over a layer of large particles, with shear applied by a top plate. And the plate also exerts a pressure at the wall with a velocity and a frictional coefficient at the wall. And at t equals 0, the plate doesn't move, and then after that, it's suddenly set into motion. Another important definition is that the bidispersed grains of density rho can be characterized by a constant intrinsical density, rho asterisk here, times solid volumetric concentration of the grains. And this concentration can be separated between small grains and large grains relatively. So the concentration of small grains plus the concentration of large grains is equal to 1. And that's a key definition, because if I speak about the concentration of smalls, I'm speaking about the reciprocal concentration of large particles. And then the large and small particles are characterized by the particle sizes, with a small diameter and a large diameter that, of course, is larger than the small diameter. And that prompts an intuitive definition of a mean or a concentration average diameter, which takes into consideration the diameters and the concentration of particles. Okay, and based on this, I can redefine or rearrange the terms, and then this asymmetric coefficient appears here, multiplying the concentration of small particles solely. So I can express or write this mean average diameter, or this mean diameter, as the large particle diameters times the phi s, and that's a powerful definition for the results. And then I express the conservation equations for this problem, which is quite simple, but only that this time I put the shear stress instead of the velocity variable. So I don't go into the definition of the viscosity. I just say that there is a diffusion of shear stress instead of a diffusion of momentum per se. For the mu of I, and this is where things get a little bit complicated, the mu of I rheology is ill-posed in a mathematical sense. So this relationship that I showed at the beginning is not well defined because it's not continuum. So this relationship is only defined when mu is within the range of mu1 and mu2. So if I have a mu that is lower than mu1, then suddenly the rheology is no longer defined. And that is really problematic for the resolution of this type of problems. And not only me is saying this. This was explored by Barker and Gray, who proposed a regularized version for this rheology. And this regularized version of the rheology expands this range of validity with the usage of these two relationships, with a point or a singular point I1 that separates these cases. But I want to at least grab your attention into this, this second relationship here, which is the one I will use in the steady state solutions in the results. But there is an extension of this mu of rheology. And not only that, but it's also convenient, and this is something that I present in this work, that is convenient to average mu. And in the same way as I averaged the diameters, I will average the frictional coefficient by the concentration phi s. And in the same fashion, I end up with a relationship that looks like this. So it's the same term as for the mean diameter here. I obtain this asymmetric kind of relationship times mu superscript L. And this mu L is evaluated with this relationship that I showed before. So it's the extended mu of rheology. And here I show basically the parameters for the large particles. So the large particles for this, they're quite small, the particles, but there are literature parameters, or the literature has parameterized, sorry, the mu of rheology for this case. Okay, so these are merely constant parameters for the numerical solutions that I will perform. Now, for the bidispersed particle size segregation, I already explained a bit how this works. Here I manipulated a little bit the expression for the segregation flux function with the parameters that I used in a previous work of mine. These are experimental constants that feed into this scaling law. Okay, here you see the pressure, here is the shear rate, and the rest are merely parameters and the variable that is the phi s. So the interesting thing is that now you see why the coupling between segregation and rheology happens, because you have a shear rate dependence here as well as a pressure dependence here for the thing that is setting the segregation within the bulk. So with the shear rate affecting the segregation flux, and here phi s affecting the rheology, basically, we have the coupled problem. Now, to provide a little bit of closure to the framework of the Stokes problem, I want to specify that the height of the shear layer will be defined by the pressure as well, and the applied frictional coefficient at the upper plate. And why this? Because, as I said, the mu of rheology is a very complicated relationship to use in numerical simulations and solutions in general, and transfers a lot of numerical problems towards the schemes. So it's convenient to define a height where the mu of rheology is well defined. Okay, so this is why I use this h. And it's also to put emphasis into a layer where the actual feedback will happen, or the relationship between segregation and rheology will happen. Okay, and also to secure the numerical stability of the solution. And putting all this into the initial system of equations, I end up with this coupled system. Note that here I make no, or I use no equation for phi s, because as I said, phi s and phi l are reciprocal. So one is one minus the other. And that allow me to just solve these two equations and not a third equation for the phi l. Nonetheless, the system is quite nonlinear. It's a highly nonlinear system, despite the fact that it's only only defining one dimension. The dimension, of course, is the vertical. but it's a quite complex system to solve. So how I solve this system, or this partial differential equation system, I use the method of lines. The method of lines uses the notion that I can discretize the system or the space and leaving only the time or the system into a time-dependent system. Okay, so what I do is the PDE system, if I discretize this in space, I will leave a system of ODEs in time. And the ODEs are well defined by the initial value problem. And the initial value problem is that I will have a layer of small particles over large particles that have a velocity of 0 at the initial condition, and then suddenly are set into motion by the upper plate. And with this initial value system of ODEs, I can solve each of these ODEs or each of these lines into the whole PDE system. It's like I discretize in time my PDE system into a system of ODEs in time, and that's the method of lines. Of course, I'm not the first one to use this. This is a very well documented method. This has also been used for granular flow problems that are attacking, for instance, granular compressibility, and also with the drawback that it is affected by the same issues I was saying in terms of the mu of variability. So it requires validation against other numerical methods or experimental experiments. Here I show validation of the method in this figure, where I compare the method of lines in the contour plots, the field contours, with the dashed contours being a direct solver implemented of MATLAB or the PDE system. Okay, so this is also something that we use in a previous work, but without the coupled rheology equations. So it was a sort of a validation before implementing the whole scheme. So now moving towards the results, I'm showing here at the left of the figure the evolution of the particle concentrations. The lighter or yellow colors correspond to the small particle concentration, and then the darker colors correspond to large particle concentrations, moving from 0 to 1 in this relative scale. And as you see, in each of the columns, I have a different size ratio, R. At the beginning, I have one that is very close to 1, then another that is 2 and 4. And as you see, as R increases, then segregation becomes increasingly not only more rapid, as you see, the time scales in which segregation happens are decreased once the size ratio is increased, but also it produces sharper segregation or sharper particle concentration profiles. As you see here, everything is well segregated, while for the R equal 1.25, there is an apparent mixing. So the profile is not very well segregated. What is interesting and what I'm showing here at the right is the evolution of the velocity profiles. And as you see, values are close to unity or to 1 will produce kind of a linear distribution of the velocity profile, while R equal to 4 produce like a non-linear profile with a very sharp interface, which is a result of the segregation. The same happens at the very early stages, which happens to be around 10, or this time scale 10, that produce sharper velocity profiles in this as the R increases. So basically, there is a highly dependent problem. It depends on the size ratio, which is something to be expected. Another interesting thing is that this is kind of decoupled. So there is a process of this very first solution here, which is this kind of broken linear solution, is completely decoupled from the segregation, which is to be expected because in this area here, segregation still doesn't alter the solution, and only around these timescales segregation happens to exert an influence in the rheology. Okay, so that allows us to perhaps seek this solution or this transitory stage solution. Okay, and this solution can be found by applying a steady state condition into the momentum equation, and this is quite simple. It only says that after the steady state is achieved, the frictional coefficient will be equal to the one applied by the plate above. And this can be replaced into the regularized mu of I rheology, which can be expressed as a quadratic equation. And then that allows us to find an ODE that can be easily solved to find the velocity profile in the vertical. Okay. And with this, I can plot, or we can plot a very clear distribution for these profiles here that are found when segregation still doesn't happen. So this is a result of the fact that at the early stages, at the early time scales, rheology and segregation are decoupled. But from that time on, when segregation starts to happen, there is an effect of segregation, and segregation redistributes friction. Not only friction, but also if I'm applying this concept of a frictional ratio, it will also produce a frictional rearrangement of the particles with no effect on segregation. So even if I change this frictional ratio, the results in terms of segregation will not change. So segregation is not altering. Sorry, this chi mu will not alter the segregation profile, but will alter the steady state solution for the velocity profile. So as I showed you before, this is the case where with this broken profile is formed at the early stages of the solution, but then it will morph into this nonlinear solution at the steady state. But if I change this chi mu to negative values, you will see that this solution in green here in the velocity profiles will move towards a positive side, but then it will regress towards the steady state in blue. But if I move towards a positive value for chi mu, you will see the opposite. So basically this behavior here is exacerbated. The linear transitory profile is sharper with this very sharp transition, and then it will move towards an even more non-linear steady state. So this is interesting because also if I use chi mu values in the middle or intermediate chi mu values, I will regress towards a linear state. So it's kind of a counteract of the size ratio influence into the non-linearity of the problem. And that's also a very relevant value because I can juggle between size ratio and this frictional ratio as counterparts of the same problem that influence this feedback, basically. I can also find an ODE solution for this nonlinear profile. It's a little bit more complex because now I have to find the steady state solution for the segregation equation. And this can be solved following this, and then finding a solution for phi s using partial fractions that will yield this equation here, that is an exponential or a ratio between exponentials with a constant of integration that depends on the average concentration, that for the whole problem will be half, because the concentration of small particles throughout the vertical due to conservation or mass conservation has to be preserved, so it has to be 1/2, and this 1/2 is preserved here in this constant of integration for the phi s profile. And the phi s profile serves as input for the momentum equation as before, but now it will be implicit in this mu hat or hat mu at the wall that depends on the concentration and as well on the chi mu parameter. And because it's implicit, I cannot solve it analytically, so I have to solve it numerically with a Runge-Kutta method, okay? And now to summarize and to compare the steady state solutions, I present this figure that is kind of a summary of not only the size ratio dependence, but also the chi-mu dependence with the fully developed velocity profiles alongside with these solutions that I found. So the transitory states are what you see in these red and blue tones. In blue corresponds to the small particles and large to the large particles, and these broken profiles are the linear transitory stages or states that I was speaking before. And as you see, as the size ratio increases, which is what I showed you before, this kind of break or slope change becomes more aggressive, with the R equal 1 at the center, or this linear behavior. And now moving towards the chi-mu solution, you will see here that the influence is that it changes this non-linear solution, becoming or kind of turning it into a more aggressive solution, or something that moves towards the linear or the identity line here. Here, the dashed dot line is the case for chi-mu equals 0, which is nonlinear by definition. So, and this solution is the one that I compared here. So this is a fully developed velocity profiles, starting from with white tones at the early stages of the momentum transfer, moving towards the darker tones, which are the steady state. And then, as you see, the steady state in the black line fits very well with the dashed dot line in red, which corresponds to this chi-mu equals 0. And at the same time, I plot the transitory analytical solution, which are this kind of mildly red and mildly blue lines, which are also kind of concentrates a lot of the profiles that corresponds to the transitory states. Okay. So this steady state solution is not perfect, of course. It kind of neglects the second order terms for the size ratio. That explains the slight difference. But at least I think I'm making a good work into capturing the behavior of the numerical solutions with the analytical solutions. And also it's interesting the appearance of this kind of rhomboid, which basically is the region where the feedback happens. So the feedback is characterized by this initial state where segregation is decoupled, and then moving towards this inverse kind of broken linear profile, which is the case that is fully segregated. Imagine that here is where the small particles are at the bottom and large particles are at the top. So this area here, this rhomboid, is the region where, or the interval where the feedback happens. Okay, and then the nonlinear solution will be bounded to this rhomboid and will happen in the midst, of course, set by the value of this frictional ratio. So it's a well-determined problem by friction and size ratio. So to summarize a little bit, the segregation rheology feedback was measured via the changes in the velocity profile that is highly dependent on the size ratio, or in other words, a symmetry coefficient, chi r, put in the same kind of language, and the frictional coefficients v, which are also can be expressed in a chi-mu in the same way as we did for the size ratio. And the main messages here is that R, of course, controls the shape and slope of the velocity profile, defines this rhomboid region, so it's where the final state will kind of stay. It will not go beyond or regress before the transitory stage. So basically, it's bounded to this area. And chi-mu will skew the steady state solution within this rhomboid region. So it will regress back to the linear solution, or will exacerbate the non-linearity that this solution shows. But it still has no effect on the transitory solution. The only effect is on the shape of the solution, but it will not affect this kind of linear or rhomboid solution. So to put a little bit of conclusion and perspective on these results, because I think I went a little bit too deep into very specific aspects of the segregation and rheology feedback. But most relevant is that this problem can be now studied numerically, and this is because the scaling law is well defined on physical parameters that depend on the same parameters that rheology depends. And for that, the Stokes problem presents an ideal configuration, because it's simple and also will capture very well how this interaction between rheology and segregation happen. Another important message is, of course, what I've been repeating the whole presentation, is that granular flow rheology is highly dependent on particle properties and how they are distributed. Okay. Another relevant message, I think, is the method of lines presents a very kind of a well-behaved method for this kind of problems. It's an efficient scheme, it's stable, and it really helps for solving these highly nonlinear PDE systems. And the last conclusion I wanna draw is on the application of this. So here I show some experimental images on an annular shear cell that is sheared from above, which is precisely neglecting the kind of the radial effects, is precisely what I've been analyzing so far. So there is something that I can still kind of validate via experiments on a facility that is quite used for rheology measurements. So this could be a door that could open the rheometry for actual granular flows, and I think that's a powerful message to finish. So with that, I finish my presentation, and thank you very much for the attention and your time. I know it's kind of sometimes it could be a little bit hard to explain everything in one presentation, but I'm open for questions if you have. So thank you very much.
Okay, Tomás, thank you very much for such an interesting presentation and very nice final picture. I think it reflects very well as a transition through the tenor track.
Yeah.
Okay, I would like to remind our audience that you can post your questions for Tomás on the chat if you are watching this presentation on YouTube. So I want to give the opportunity to our audience to give some questions.
Maybe they can raise their hands.
Yeah, maybe if anybody is
submitting.
Okay. So we have Professor Aldo Tamburrino here. He has a few questions for Tomás. Okay. Good afternoon, Aldo. Please feel free.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Well, in your picture here, you have, of course, this is a mud flow, but it contains water. But your analysis is a dry. I understood that was dry flow, or I'm wrong?
Yes, it's mostly dry, or at least it is valid if particles or fluid doesn't lubricate contacts. So it's a mechanism mainly driven by particle contacts. If particle contacts are decreased in any sort of way, then this whole thing kind of falls apart. But that's, of course, is yeah.
Okay, and the small particles are not small enough to percolate through the voids left by the bigger ones. So at least is that what I saw in your drawing when you posed the problem. So how would it change if the particles are small enough to percolate among the voids left by the larger ones?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, yes, as you said, this doesn't allow spontaneous percolation. That's the first thing. So the scaling law that I developed in my PhD thesis doesn't go into spontaneous percolation, and that's for different reasons. One is that spontaneous percolation basically violates one of the main hypotheses, which is that the small and large particles sum up to 1, and that 1 is relative to the solid's volume fraction. So if the solid's volume fraction, or if the particles are allowed to spontaneously percolate, then the solid volume fraction may change, and then we're facing a compressibility problem. Basically, small particles will change the solid's volume fraction, and that kind of moderates the whole theory. So all this is valid until R is around 4. That's as much as I can stretch out the scaling law. So yeah.
Okay. And I have another question.
Just to finish, this is a matter of active research now. So
yeah. Okay.
So
and another question. It is very interesting that you got a time scale where you can after that the velocity profiles can be considered that they are not changes. They don't change any longer. But could you get the possibility that the small particles gets completely segregated from the larger one, or you are always having a portion in the flow with a large particles?
yeah, another very well. Maybe I will go back to the. So that's the answer is embedded here. So the problem with or why I cannot achieve like a fully segregated profile so far is because of the diffusivity. Okay. So if diffusion is 0, or the diffusivity between small and large particles is 0, then I will inevitably arrive for all cases to a fully segregated profile. But the case is that particles do show diffusion, and that's a problem. Mm-hmm. And then it's the only way. That's also an active thing because there isn't a clear diffusivity coefficient for this problem. I'm using here is the reference, is Utter and Beringer. So they calculated a diffusivity of particles, but there isn't a clear diffusivity coefficient for this problem. So that's also an active. In full fairness, the scaling law I developed is for the convective kind of term for segregation, but there is no consistent diffusive term for that. So that could be an interesting thing to explore.
Yes, and finally, I think that it would be interesting to try the second Stokes problem. I mean, when the plate is oscillating. So as there is some kind of irreversibility, the point is that the granular are not reversible. Maybe I'm wondering if your model will catch that effect, and how far is the solution from the liquid second Stokes problem. But I guess that it's not hard to tackle that problem.
It's hard.
It's hard.
And why it's so hard? Yeah, why it's so hard is because of the mu of I rheology. So the mu of I rheology doesn't behave well with no movement, basically. So if velocity is 0, so every time I pass by an area where velocity is 0, the solution will fall or will be unstable, and that's the main hurdle for this. So to make it reversible, I will have to make kind of is when you have a block, like there are ways to solve that, and and it's like treat the no movement condition as a solid block. If I can arrange that, kind of a stick slip solution for that. If I do that, then it's possible to solve. But then, yeah, in the perspective of the feedback, it's not that much interesting, the second Stokes problem. The third one is more interesting because the third problem is basically the flow over a slope, or some people call it that the third Stokes problem. So the flow over a slope, that is something that also could be the third Stokes problem could be also interesting.
Yeah, but okay, don't go through the oscillating plate. The pulsating plate means that this goes so in such a way that never get this zero gradient profile. That could have an analytical solution.
Yeah, that could have. Yeah, maybe that could be a way to tackle. I think it's possible, but then the steady state solutions will be hard to obtain, I think.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
All right, so we're running out of time. So thank you, Tomás. Thanks a lot for your time and for giving such an interesting presentation. And we hope to see our audience in our next webinar in 2 more weeks.
3 more weeks.
In 3 more weeks.
Yeah.
3 more weeks.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
No, thanks to you, Tomás, and good afternoon, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much.